And so just to mention briefly again what we will cover. So we'll start by looking a little bit around the need to transform food systems and why we need to do this for both human and planetary health. And then, as I mentioned just now, what are some of these areas of debate and controversy when it comes to healthy and sustainable diets? And I'd like to get your opinion via a few polls once we come to that point. And then some around the health and also environmental benefits that are likely if we can follow the Eat Well guide more closely. The suggested action areas for shifting us in the right direction towards the Eat Well guide and towards a healthier and more sustainable dietary pattern, and some tips for how we can do this. And then, as Frances mentioned, I'll pass back to her and for her to talk through some of the resources being developed and currently available for supporting on this as well. Okay, and so I'm sure many of you already will know quite a bit of this or have heard about it, of course, no doubt. It's getting more and more attention all of the time, of course, in the media, particularly with, for example, COP26 last year. And that is that the food systems, the way in which we produce, transport, consume, dispose of foods are very important, not only for personal health, but also for planetary health as well. So if we look on the people side, we know that about 1 in 5 deaths globally is linked to consuming a poor diet. And currently, about 2 billion adults are overweight or obese, but at the same time, about 500 million are underweight. And we know that if we look more closely in the UK, figures for England show that over 2/3 of men and about 6 out of 10 women are either overweight or obese. And that also, very importantly, for when we look at schools, we know that the proportion of children that are living with overweight or obesity increases from the time that they first start in reception class to when they finish year 6. But also on the planetary side, we know, of course, that the food we produce is a large driver of environmental change. And that includes, for example, being responsible for about between 1/4 to 1/3 of all greenhouse gases. That depends on which estimate you look at. The vast majority of fresh water use globally, as well as a significant proportion of land use as well. And alongside this, of course, we know that we have to feed a growing population, and that this is a challenge that is becoming ever more important as we move towards the middle part of this century, where it's estimated in 2050 that we will have close to 10 billion people. And this is expected to lead to about a 50% increase in worldwide demand for food. And alongside this, about 70% increase in the demand for animal-based foods, particularly as incomes in developing nations, for example, increase. And alongside this, food production will need to increase as well, commensurate by about 50%. And I think it's important to say at a global level as well that we know that nutrition and food security play a pivotal role in achieving, in some way, all 17 of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And so this raises the question of how we can continue to feed, or to feed in a better and a healthy way, a growing population, to reduce malnutrition and poor health related to diet, while also reducing the environmental effects of our current food system as well. So I think it's useful, before we go into this in a bit more detail, and before I get your opinion on some of the issues in this area, to look a bit more at what do we mean when we talk about a healthier and more sustainable diet. So there is a definition that has been provided by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization about 10 years ago now. And that included aspects such as, of course, a low environmental impact, but also other important factors to think about as well. Health, but also, of course, what's nutritionally adequate in our diets. Affordability, which of course is becoming ever more important this year against the backdrop of the current cost of living crisis. But then also, of course, alongside that, what is accessible and also what's culturally acceptable. It's very important when we talk about healthier, more sustainable diets to think not just about where we should be getting to and what diet will be ideal, but of course, where are we at the moment? What types of foods, what types of diets do we eat currently in the UK, in Europe, and in other areas around the world as well? And so whilst this is a very useful definition, it encompasses a lot of different factors, of course. And so how can we really put this into practice? And when we especially think about trying to balance out some of these different factors, there's a lot of debate around what exactly a healthier and more sustainable diet should or should not contain. And so I'd like to move on now to cover a few areas of sort of debate and controversy, if you like, in this area, and to get your opinion as well on what you think. Firstly, around the role of locally produced foods. Okay, so very interesting. So it looks like we've got about a 2/3 to 1/3 split between those who say yes, locally produced is important, and about a third who say that it depends. So thank you very much for participating in that poll, and let's take a look at this in a bit more detail in terms of what some of the science in this area says. So we know, of course, that local can be very important for some of those aspects of sustainability, especially in a social aspect. We know that, of course, supporting our local producers in our area or British farmers, for example, will have a positive impact in that social sense. But what about when it comes to the environment? One thing we do know that there's a huge variation in the environmental impact of foods, depending on both where and how they're produced. And you don't need to worry about too much of the detail of what you see on the right, but this is from a very large data set that was released a few years ago. And one of the things in here that you could see was that if we compare, for example, the top 10 most impactful producers of beef to the bottom 10% of least impactful producers, there's a very large difference in, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, a 12-fold difference, and also a 50 times greater use of land for the most impactful producers. And alongside this, I think it's important to make the point that most of the emissions from the global food system actually occur at the pre-farm gate stage, so during the stages of initial production. And although supply chain emissions from, for example, processing, packaging, transport, household consumption, waste disposal, etc., they are becoming increasingly more important. We find that the vast majority of emissions still occurs at the pre-farm gate stage. So whilst things such as food miles and transport, and even things such as packaging may seem very important, and of course they are, in terms of the overall picture, one of the largest determinants of environmental impact seems to be where and how we produce foods. And so what about the picture in the UK specifically? So in the UK, agriculture accounts for about 11% of territorial emissions, and this has actually decreased over the last 30 years. I think it's important, though, to mention that when we talk about territorial emissions, this is of course those for foods that are produced in the UK. And so we can't really account in this for those that are imported, which can be very important, of course, especially for things such as fruit and vegetables. And if we look at livestock specifically, that accounts for about close to 7% of territorial emissions in the UK, which is a bit lower than separate estimates for the EU average, although it's important to say that these two were produced in different ways. But the overall point really is that it's important that we distinguish between local and global figures as much as we can do, and where it's possible when we talk about environmental impact. And so I'd like to move on now to look at plant-based diets, and to ask your opinion firstly, if Francis can help me again with launching this poll. What do you think a plant-based diet is? Do you think this is a vegan diet, a vegetarian diet, or a flexitarian style diet? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so quite an interesting split here. Hopefully you can all see this as well. So we've got about a third of people saying vegan, just under 20% went for vegetarian, and then half actually exactly went for flexitarian. So very interesting, and interesting to see how that has divided the room in terms of opinion. And that's actually something that we found in a survey that we did at the British Nutrition Foundation towards the end of 2020 now, where we asked over 2,000 adults from across Britain what they thought a plant-based diet means. And you can see that about 61% thought this was a vegan or vegetarian diet. And that only a relatively small proportion compared to yourselves thought that this was a flexitarian style diet. So why is this? Why does there appear to be some disagreement around what a plant-based diet means? Well, one thing it's important to note is that currently there's no legal definition of what a plant-based food means, even though we're seeing, of course, so many products being advertised as plant-based, or that have plant-based on the packaging, for example, particularly now in supermarkets. However, products must comply with existing legislation. So, for example, if a new plant-based food were to fall into to be categorized as a novel food, for example. And also, novel plant-based alternatives are likely to actually be classified as ultra-processed under the NOVA definition, which you may have heard of, which classifies foods based on the degree of processing, which has been used in a lot of studies and associated with poor health outcomes in a lot of observational studies recently. And also, there's no accepted definition if we look at a plant-based diet into either from industry or from the research community or among the public, and to whether or not this can contain any animal source foods or not. One example that I have pulled out here is from the WHO that they published last year, where they included in their definition that plant-based diets emphasize foods that are mainly derived from plant sources with lower consumption or exclusion of animal products, and that vegetarian diets can be a subset of plant-based diets. And so overall, there's not really any agreement on this term, and of course that could be possibly what's driving confusion. But if we look at this in the context of dietary guidance in the UK, we know that the Eat Well guide, in terms of the proportion of groups, food groups that it shows, is a dietary pattern that is mainly plant-based. Of course, we have the carbohydrates, starchy foods groups, and also, of course, the fruit and vegetables groups, which together contribute just over 2/3. And then also, of course, it's recommended that we prioritize plant-based protein sources as well within the protein source food group. But of course, the Eat Well guide does still include some moderate amounts of meat, fish, dairy, and eggs as well. It's worth noting that some plant-based products may have attracted a health halo that might not be justified because they might be high in saturated fat, salt, or sugars, and that they also might not provide essential nutrients that are found in animal-based food equivalents. So, for example, if we think about milk alternatives, then while some of these are fortified, not all of them might contain things like vitamin B12, or also things like iodine, which is for which milk, or cow's milk, is a large provider on average, about 1/3 of iodine intake in the UK diet. And so, overall, it appears that there is some confusion around this term, and that raises the question of whether or not alternative terms like plant-rich or plant-forward could help to kind of emphasize the proportions of what we eat in our diet more. Okay, so the third question I'd like to get your opinion on is whether or not you think that a healthier and more sustainable diet, so feeding on a little bit from the last one, but can this contain animal-based foods? Do you think it should be vegan? Do you think that some meat, fish, dairy, and eggs is okay in moderation, or are you not sure? Oh, okay, interesting. So everyone went for some meat, fish, dairy, or eggs in moderation. Okay, so that's interesting to see. Thank you very much. Interesting that nobody went for the vegan option. And so, just to talk a little bit though around vegan diets and sustainability, and of course linking in with the theme of plant-based as well. What the evidence tends to show is that yes, adopting a vegan diet could lead to large reductions against our current average diets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and also land use as well. And it's also likely to have health benefits. However, there are other things to consider. It's possible that adopting a vegan diet could increase water footprint. And also, what we know is that it's unlikely that many people will do this, or that will stick to following a vegan or a vegetarian diet for any substantial amount of time. So some of the best available data from the UK, published in January this year, shows that only about 1% of people in the UK identify as vegan, and about 4% as vegetarian. And also, of course, from a nutritional perspective, we need to think about, if we're excluding animal-derived foods entirely from our diets, how this might affect our intakes or bioavailability, as well as some important nutrients, things like iron, zinc, iodine, but also vitamins A and B12 as well. Now, this could be potentially a cause for concern for some groups where we know there's already evidence of poor diets or poor quality diets, and also low nutrient intakes or status. So one example would be that about 1 in 10 girls in the UK, 11 to 18, is estimated to have iron deficiency and anemia. And so if restricting or excluding animal-based foods from the diet, what will the impact be? And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about that briefly before moving on. So if we are restricting or eliminating animal-based foods from our diets, this doesn't just, of course, need to be for a vegetarian or vegan diet. It could be, of course, if we're looking to reduce the proportion of animal-based foods in our diet. Then, if not consuming a diverse diet, there are some nutrients that we need to think about. So, for example, vitamin B12 we know is only typically provided naturally in foods of animal origin, but also as well, you can see there in the table that there are quite a substantial proportion of some other important nutrients as well that are provided at the moment on average by animal-based foods in our diet, according to the National Diet Nutrition Survey. And then also if we think about iron, for example, it's more bioavailable from animal sources than from plant sources. Vitamin D as well, vitamin D3 supplements are typically made from sheep's wool, although vegan alternatives are available out there. And this is more effective at raising vitamin D levels in the blood than vitamin D2 is. And also when we think about some of the compounds in plant-based sources of things like calcium, iron, and zinc, so I think that includes things like oxalic acid that can bind a lot of the calcium that's contained in spinach, but also phytic acid as well that can bind up iron and zinc as well and mean that it's not as readily accessible and absorbable. And also I mentioned iodine before. Milk and dairy products are the main contributors to UK intakes at all ages, and some milk alternatives are not fortified. So these are just a few of the important sort of nutritional considerations to think about. And so the fourth and final question I'd like to ask you, which is an open answer, and it'd be good if you could try to keep this to just a few words if possible, but what do you think is, I mean, there are a lot of areas of where we can change, of course, but for you, what do you think is the most important change that we can make now to have a diet that's healthier and more sustainable as well?
Quite a lot of them, and we can share these later on with people if they're interested, but quite a lot of them are around eating seasonally and locally, including more plant-based foods in our meals, including local UK produce where possible, eat more of a plant-based diet with locally produced foods where possible and reduce food waste, either waste less food or eat less food of higher environmental footprint, less fast food outlets, battling climate change is a priority, reduce availability of processed ready meals and takeaways, eat seasonally, cut down fats and sugars.
So whatever what your answer was, I think it's important to stress that there's no one size fits all to such a complex problem as this. And of course, we saw before that there are a lot of different factors to balance out if we consider this more holistic idea of healthy and sustainable. But there are some actions that we can all take to benefit our own health and that of the planet. And this is sort of centered around the 6 points that you see here, really. So the main one is overarching in terms of the potential benefits from following the Eat Well guide. But then also within that, other separate 5 other separate actions that can help us to do that around more fruit and vegetables, diversifying our protein sources, having fewer foods high in fat, salt, and sugar, and also choosing more sustainable sources of fish and seafood, as well as, very importantly, wasting less food and drinks. And so I'd like to look now into each of these areas in a little bit more detail and to offer some tips for how we might try to do this. But firstly, in terms of the Eat Well guide, we all know this is important from a health perspective, but also following the Eat Well guide more closely can also have environmental benefits. So one analysis showed that following the guide more closely could reduce greenhouse gases associated with our diet and also lead to a small reduction in water use as well as reducing mortality risk as well. And in terms of cultural acceptability, we know that the Eat Well guide, broadly speaking, is an eating pattern or can allow us to interpret this in a way that is an eating pattern that's familiar to us in the UK and that can include some nutrient-rich animal source foods in moderation. And Francis and the education team have been working on some different recipes from different cultures, and that I think are now available, I believe, on the Food Effective Life website. And we know that about just over 30% of people in the UK achieve at least 5 out of the 9 recommendations in that analysis I showed just now. But there's room for improvement because only 0.1% managed to achieve all 9 of the recommendations. And so how can we do this? Well, eating more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, higher fiber, starchy foods, as well as beans and other pulses would help to increase fiber intakes and to move us closer to the Eat Well guide. At the moment, though, we know that in terms of fiber intakes, fewer than 1 in 5 children 4 to 10 and fewer than 1 in 10 adolescents and adults currently meet the age-specific fiber recommendations. Now, the second area is to consider eating ways to eat more fruit and vegetables. So we know that these are an important source of essential vitamins and minerals as well as fiber in our diets, and that we should aim for at least 5 portions a day. And that by doing this, this can reduce the risk of heart disease, stroke, and some cancers. And that 1 portion is about 80 grams. Although fruit and vegetable juices and smoothies can also, in small amounts, account towards 1 of our portions a day, as can also as well a portion of pulses. But of course, variety is important to provide different essential nutrients as well. But we know at the moment that only about 1/3 of UK adults, but fewer than 1 in 8 adolescents get their 5 a day. So what are a few ways in which we can do this? So we could try, for example, swapping snacks where possible. So trying to aim for healthier snacks like fruit. Also finding ways to add either fresh, frozen or canned vegetables into recipes when cooking. As well as, for example, adding fruit to breakfast cereal in the morning could be a sliced banana or apple, or maybe a handful of fresh or frozen berries. Now, the third point is to look at diversifying our choice of protein sources. Now, this is something that is recommended within the wording of the Eat Well guide, but we should try to rebalance in favor of more plant-based sources of protein, including things like beans and other pulses, but also nuts and seeds, and also plant-based meat alternatives as well, but provided they're not high in saturated fat or salt. And we can also include this alongside some moderate amounts of meat, fish, dairy products and eggs. But it's not just about protein. We also need to consider the overall nutrient composition of plant-based alternative foods and whether or not they provide some of the important essential nutrients we looked at before that are typically provided by animal-based foods in a readily absorbable form. So beans and other pulses, as well as nuts and seeds, can also provide fiber in our diets as well. And a few ways that we can try to diversify and rebalance our protein sources in the diet include, for example, adding canned beans or chickpeas to a dish. And one personal favorite in our house is to have a midweek salad with a can of chickpeas, for example. We're also having a small handful of nuts or seeds unsalted as a snack. Now, these are, again, just 2 suggestions. There are lots of different ways that we can aim to do this. Now, when it comes to foods high in fat, salt, and sugar, well, we all know that these foods are not recommended as a core group within the Eat Well guide, and that they are not the healthiest choices if we think about cakes, biscuits, pies, and pastries. But also, perhaps a lot of us maybe don't quite often really think that much about the fact that these can contribute quite a lot potentially to the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the land and water use associated with our diets. And in particular, if they make up quite a large proportion in terms of energy in the diet, and we're eating these foods in large amounts or quite often. So this is perhaps an area of our diet that isn't often thought about in terms of environmental impact. And so how can we look to do this? Well, firstly, we can try to be more aware of our portion sizes. So, for example, placing a smaller amount of crisps into a bowl or buying multi-packs, or thinking about the size of the portions when we do have these foods. But also planning ahead with healthier snack options is another thing we can do as well. So it could be, for example, low sugar whole wheat cereal, wholemeal toast and peanut butter, or things like fat-free, added sugar yogurt, possibly with some berries as well. Or again, things like fruit that I mentioned on the previous slide. So there are lots of different ways that we can try to do this and try to displace these foods for healthier options in our diet. Now, another area is around choosing sustainable fish and seafood. So we know that fish provides not just protein, but also vitamins and minerals, as well as long chain omega-3 fats that are thought to be good for heart health. And that, of course, we should have at least 2 portions of fish a week, and we should make one of those an oily fish. But as you've no doubt heard, there are issues, of course, around overfishing when it comes to fish and seafood. At the moment, about a third of global fish stocks are considered to be overfished. And so it's important that we try to support a more sustainable industry by making sustainable choices where we can. Now, this again it can be quite a confusing area, but these are just a few ways that we can look to do this. So firstly, experimenting with a wider variety of fish outside of the big five. Now, the ones you see there in brackets, cod, haddock, tuna, salmon, and prawns make up about 80% of what we typically eat in the UK. So if we can try to eat a wider variety, this can help to spread or to ease the pressures a bit in terms of fish stocks. Also looking out for eco labels. So I'm sure you recognize some of the ones here in the bottom left, and these are increasingly appearing now in supermarkets, including on own brand products. So the blue MSC logo is quite widely used now, as well as the ASC logo for farmed seafood. And the link you can see in the bottom left there, you could also find this if you go to our website in the news section, is a link to a blog that covers this topic as well in some more detail if you're interested. The third and final thing we can do is try to choose more sustainable options through the Good Fish Guide. So the Marine Conservation Society produces this guide and updates this about once a year, and it can be downloaded as an app, and that can help you to make some more sustainable choices when either shopping in store or perhaps if trying to decide or to choose fish, for example, for a recipe. And important to forget that frozen and canned fish as well can generally tend to be cheaper and last longer than fresh options, and shouldn't be forgotten about in terms of our seafood choices. Okay, so the final area I'd like to talk about is wasting less food and drinks. So the FAO estimates that about a third of food is either lost in the supply chain or wasted globally, and that this accounts as well for about 8 to 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions from all sources. And the UK has made good progress in this area in recent years in reducing food waste. So you can see there, hopefully in the top right, some statistics about the amount of food waste reduction in the UK in recent years. And also industry has been responding as well to this challenge, such as through the Courtauld Commitment 2030, which aims to reduce UK food waste by 50% by 2030. However, though, at the moment, a survey by WRAP, the Waste and Resources Action Programme, found that only about a third of UK adults actually see a clear link between wasting food and climate change. And so it appears that there's some more that maybe needs to be done to really raise awareness of this clear link between food waste and as a driver of climate change. But very importantly, of course, at the moment, food waste also costs money, and it's estimated that the amount of food waste in the UK costs the average household with children about £60 per month. So these are just a few suggestions again, and there are many, many different creative ways to try to waste less food, both in terms of recipes and in terms of food redistribution, food sharing. But these are just a few suggestions for things that we might want to try. So, for example, using food labels properly. So ensuring that we take notice of the storage information, as well as knowing the difference, for example, between best before and use by dates, so that we don't throw away food that is still okay and is still safe to eat. And also planning ahead our meals before we go shopping, if possible, to make sure that we get the things that we need and the things that we want to cook the recipes that we plan. And that could link in with, for example, plans to do batch cooking, maybe to have healthier options available during the week. And also setting our fridge to the correct temperature, as well as our freezer also. And this can help to reduce food waste, because at the moment, the average fridge temperature in the UK is actually above this 0 to 5 degrees Celsius range. And that can, of course, mean that foods go off more quickly. It's estimated that about 3 million glasses of milk are poured down sinks every day in the UK. And so setting our fridge to the correct temperature can also make sure that foods last longer. Okay, and so well, hopefully that gives a fairly good overview of this area and the fact that we know there's an urgent need to transform food systems to support both human and planetary health. But then when it comes to healthier and more sustainable diets, there are a range of different things we need to think about, not just environmental impact, but also nutrition, health, of course, cost and affordability, as well as what's culturally acceptable as well. The Eat Well Guide provides a good direction for us to do this, and is a plant-rich dietary pattern that is familiar to many people in the UK. And following the Eat Well Guide is more closely is likely to have both health and environmental benefits, but there's room for improvement in terms of the number of us currently achieving the recommendations. And so overall, we need to try to find ways, as shown in those action areas, hopefully, to increase our intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grain, and also higher fiber, starchy foods, as well as sustainably sourced fish, and also plant protein sources like beans, lentils, and other pulses. At the same time as also limiting less healthy foods, so those are high in fat, salt, and sugar, and also very importantly, reducing the amount of foods and drinks that we waste. And so thank you very much for listening. And I'd just like to flag before passing over to Francis that we do have more information on this topic on our website. If you're interested, you can go to nutrition.org.uk. And also, if you'd like even more of a deep dive into this subject, you might want to look at a paper that we published last year, a nutrition bulletin on this subject, which provide a lot of the findings for the areas that I just talked about now. So I'll pass you back over to Francis. Thank you.
So hopefully you can see this. So that was really interesting. So thank you very much, Simon, and has given us some really good hints and tips and some background information that hopefully the teachers will be able to pass on to the pupils at school, and builds on really nicely from Ewan's webinar last week, which was all around plant-based diets. And we talked about expanding pupils' learning experiences through diversity. So if you weren't able to join us last week, do have a look for the recording for that, because hopefully that will support what we've learned today as well. So as far as our resources, we have got areas on the website which are around healthier, sustainable diets. But we would like some help really to find out what it is that you would like with support with going forward. So at the moment, we've just sort of almost brought together a collection of the resources that we think are suitable for this area. But actually over the next year, both we with Food Effective Life and British Nutrition Foundation want to produce some new resources. And I'm going to ask you in a couple of minutes' time just to give me some ideas of the kind of things that you would find most useful in the areas that you think would be a priority. So if you can just sort of have that in the back of your mind for the moment. But in the meantime, just to give you an idea of some of the resources that we've got. So Simon talked a lot about the Eat Well Guide. As you probably know, we've got vast numbers of resources around healthy eating and Eat Well Guide on the website. But particularly one thing you might find interesting and useful for the pupils is an Eat Well Guide knowledge organizer. We have knowledge organizers which are for all age phases and all of the topics that we've got on the website, but this one particularly might be useful for you to have a look at and to give to the pupils, or to use to base your teaching on. We've got areas, again, for each of the age phases around food commodities, and particularly for today, what we're talking about, we've got lots of resources around fruit and vegetables, and then also fish and seafood. And also, if you're thinking about diversifying protein sources, we've got some resources around mycoprotein. So we've got a presentation and a worksheet and a quiz that you might find useful for your pupils. And then we've got this new activity, which is using leftovers. We've got a presentation that goes with it, but also an activity. And the activity is pupils have to choose from the information that they're given, one seasonal food, 4 leftovers from cards that they pull out randomly from an envelope or from a bag, and then any item from the store cupboard. And then from that, they then need to then decide what it is that they could make. And it really gets them thinking about how they could use leftovers, what's in season, what's perhaps normally kept in the store cupboard, and actually try and come up with something that actually may sound and taste quite good. So that's quite a fun one to do with them. We've also got some challenge-based activities which link quite nicely with this. So the challenge-based activities are pupils are given a challenge, and then there's a PowerPoint presentation provided, which the first few slides just to sort of set the scene and then a bit of a stimulus, lots of photographs and facts and questions for the pupils. And then the back end of the presentation is more like a teacher's guide, and that's got lots of links to resources and activities that the pupils can do either individually, in groups or in pairs, in order to achieve the challenge. So for this particular context, we've got 2 for the secondary age group, which are each a way around the UK challenge and the Journey of Your Meal challenge. So those could be something quite good to get the pupils doing over the next couple of weeks towards the end of term, so something else to focus on. And then also we've got lots of farm to fork videos and quizzes. Now these were previously from the Tesco Eat Happy project, and I know some teachers have identified these in the past as being useful, but we have them on the website and they also have quizzes attached to them as well. We've also got quite a lot of Healthy Eating Week resources. So Healthy Eating Week was last week, and we've got lots of resources around this particular topic. So on here, we've got some around food waste food waste on the next one. Actually, this one is about bingo. So fruit and vegetable bingo, different types of portions of fruit and vegetables, and then also thinking about fibre and increasing the fibre content, which you would do if you eat more fruit and vegetables, and then obviously some beans and pulses and other fibre-rich foods. And then we've also got other ones, and these are the ones around food waste. So we've got a food waste audit that you could get the pupils to do at home or at school. You've got a little bit of a fact sheet about food waste. And then there's some more information about diversifying protein sources, which include a salad bar suggestion, which again, you could do as an activity in the classroom, or you could look at eating more beans and doing a little test with the pupils if they know the kinds of beans and pulses that are included in one of the PowerPoint presentations. So they're all available on the nutrition.org.uk website, and the link is on the PowerPoint, which you'll get. So this is where I want to ask you some questions then. So really thinking about what the priority areas would be for you as a teacher and how we can really help you. So I'm going to launch the poll now. And what I'd like you to do is indicate the 3 top messages that you would think would be a really good priority for us to concentrate over the next year. So it would be 3 answers. So let's get this up. So this is going to be really useful for us. So thank you very much. So, so follow the Eat Well guide, 32%, eat more fruit and vegetables, 29%. Diversifying the protein sources. Now, obviously quite a number of people would like some information about that. Limiting foods high in fat, salt or sugar. Choose sustainable fish and seafood. So obviously that's not quite so popular. Same with eat more fruit and vegetables, but waste less food, that seems to be the most popular. So that's really helpful to us. So thank you very much. And then also the next slide talks about the types of resources. So again, I'm going to pull up a poll and just ask you about the kind of resources that would be most useful to you. So would you like PowerPoint presentations? Would you like pupil worksheets, pupil activities? So that could be independent research tasks, questions, topics, some more challenge-based activities. Further webinars, would that be useful if we focused on a particular topic? We have actually got one next week, which is about tackling food waste in schools, or some virtual practical workshops. So we've been running those for the last couple of years. We're planning what we're going to do going forward. So if there's any practical workshops that you think would be useful, then please tick that on the list. And particularly perhaps put any comments in the chat. That would be helpful too. Okay, that's really helpful again. So 85% pupil activities, independent research tasks, etc. So not just worksheets, although worksheets have scored highly as well. So PowerPoint presentations, further webinars. Okay, if you've got any thoughts about what you might like as a webinar, then please do put that in the chat box. And then again, as I said, the virtual practical workshops, if they've got any ideas, we'd really like to hear from you, because obviously what we want to do is make sure that what we do is going to be really helpful for you as teachers. Okay, so before we get Simon back and we see if there's any questions for him, just want to talk about further training. I did mention that we've got a webinar next week. So this is with Dr. Jason O'Rourke, who's a primary head teacher, and it's all about tackling food waste in schools. But it's not just looking at primary schools, it's suitable for all settings. And Jason's going to be talking about his whole school approach, so looking at food waste across the whole school day. And then I'm going to be particularly talking about the ways to try and reduce food waste around food and nutrition lessons. So if you're able to join us next week, that would be great. We do have webinar recordings available, so everything that we do is recorded, and they're available on the Food Effective Life website, but also on our YouTube channel. And then we have online modular courses too. So you can find out all about those on the Food Effective Life website. But also, if you wanted to sign up for our PPD information newsletter, comes out every couple of months, you can find out about what sort of training is going to be coming up from that. Okay, so before we finish, I've got one question to ask Simon. I don't know if you've spotted any in the chat box, but if I just ask my one first, and then if you come in a moment, Ewan, that would be fantastic. So one of the comments, Simon, that I saw in the chat box was about eating more vegetables, and in brackets first, than fruit. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not sure if that might relate to, obviously, prioritizing, especially if we think about younger children, if thinking in a primary setting, a veg first approach. So we know, of course, that excuse me, that it can be difficult to get children to eat the fruits and vegetables, but particularly vegetables, and especially those that might be bitter tasting. So things like kale or cabbage or broccoli, some of these ones that are really important, especially if we think about diversity. And so, yeah, trying to encourage a liking for fruit and vegetables, as much as possible at an early age is really important, because children, of course, when the food habits that they form earlier in life there is evidence to show that they can track into when they were a teenager, and possibly even to when they become adults as well. So yes, vegetables, very, very important, particularly very much from a health perspective, but also as well from an environmental perspective. We know that generally speaking, fruits and vegetables have a lower environmental impact than some other food groups as well.
Great, thank you. And I suppose a similar thing to that is about fish as well, and about trying to encourage early eating of fish, because I know for some young children, and even the secondary pupils that I worked with, that they weren't always quite so keen on fish, but it's to trying to get the message across how important it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's as I mentioned in there, fish and other types of seafood are very, very nutrient dense foods, and there are also some different options outside of the norm, outside of those big five that we can try. You could think about possibly trying out things like maybe mussels. These can be relatively sort of cheap and available, and known to have among the lowest environmental impact of any form of seafood. But yeah, it is a very, very important area to try and focus on as well.
Great, thank you. Right, Ewan, do you have any questions?
Yes, thanks, Frances. Yeah, we've got a couple of comments and questions. Just following on from the vegetable things, interesting comment in chat saying that Polish recommendations are to eat 3 times more veg than fruit. So that was quite interesting. We also have a question from Karen for Simon, which is, why do foods high in fat or sugar cause more carbon emissions?
Yeah, very good question. And I perhaps didn't go into this in as much detail as a sort of could have if I had more time there, really. But it's not necessarily so much that high fat, salt, sugar foods are associated with more carbon emissions or land or water use. It's more really around the frequency with which we have these in our diets. And there is evidence showing, for example, from Australia, that if HFSS foods are making up quite a large proportion of what we eat in our diet, then they, of course, can make up quite a large proportion of the overall carbon emissions. I mean, there are some less healthy foods, for example, like sugar sweetened beverages that actually have quite a low environmental impact. But of course, when we think about healthy and sustainable altogether, we wouldn't, of course, recommend these from a health perspective. And so, again, it's about thinking sort of holistically about this.